December 23, 1944, the Ardennes forest. For 7 days, German armored columns had been pushing west through freezing mud and narrow roads, completely shrouded in a thick, low-hanging gray fog. The soldiers had grown used to it. The heavy clouds were their armor. Then the temperature dropped, the wind shifted, and the heavy gray ceiling broke wide open. Suddenly, the sky was a brilliant, blinding blue, and out of that blue came the sound, a low drone that swelled into a deafening roar as hundreds of Allied fighters and transport planes swarmed the open airspace above Bastogne. The weather hadn't just changed. The only protection keeping the massive German offensive alive had just vanished. This sudden vulnerability was not some unforeseen stroke of bad luck. It was the collapse of the central premise behind Germany's last great offensive in the West. We often think of military campaigns being decided by superior firepower, brilliant tactical maneuvers, or overwhelming manpower. But in the winter of 1944, Adolf Hitler wagered the entire survival of his Western armies on a meteorological forecast. He knew his forces could no longer survive in the open against the crushing weight of Allied air superiority. So he built a massive armored thrust around a narrow, promised window of severe winter storms, a temporary, fragile shield of fog, snow, and low clouds designed to completely paralyze American and British aviation. This was a massive military operation running on a strict, uncontrollable countdown governed by nature. The offensive was a desperate gamble on bad weather, not on an invincible army. As long as the sky remained thick and impenetrable, the German columns had a fighting chance to move, but nature does not hold its breath forever. The entire strategy demanded that the army shatter the front and achieve its objectives before the barometer inevitably shifted. It forces a profound question about the nature of this late war gamble. What exactly happens to a massive armored thrust, an entire campaign completely dependent on fog and low visibility, when the sky suddenly clears before the spearheads can reach their targets? To understand why the German high command deliberately shackled the fate of hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of irreplaceable tanks to something as unpredictable as a winter storm, you have to rewind to the planning stages in the autumn of 1944. Germany's strategic position in the West was deteriorating rapidly. The Allies had successfully broken out of Normandy, swept across France, and were grinding against the borders of the Reich itself. But beneath the lines on the map lay a far more critical imbalance, an imbalance that dictated every operational decision made by both sides: absolute Allied dominance of the skies. By late 1944, the combined strength of the United States Army Air Forces and the British Royal Air Force had achieved total air supremacy over Western Europe. The once feared Luftwaffe was a shattered remnant of its former self, bled white in a brutal war of attrition, crippled by chronic shortages of trained pilots and high-octane aviation fuel. The sky no longer belonged to Germany. It was entirely owned by the enemy. This air supremacy fundamentally changed how war was fought on the ground. For the Germans, daylight movement had become a lethal proposition. Allied fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and Hawker Typhoons roamed almost at will, aggressively hunting targets of opportunity. They didn't just attack frontline positions, they systematically strangled the German logistical network. Supply convoys, troop trains, marching columns, and armored reserves moving toward the front were relentlessly targeted. The roads themselves became kill zones. Any attempt to mass forces for a major counterattack in clear weather would be instantly detected by high-altitude Allied reconnaissance aircraft, and then violently broken apart by waves of tactical bombers before the German spearheads could even cross the line of departure. Hitler's grand strategic vision for a massive counteroffensive in the West, a sudden, violent, armored thrust through the thinly defended Ardennes forest, aimed at crossing the Meuse River, seizing the vital port of Antwerp, and splitting the British and American armies in two, was fundamentally incompatible with this reality. You cannot execute a rapid, deep penetration armored offensive if every tank column you organize is bombed into burning wreckage the moment it leaves the assembly area. The German planners faced an impossible tactical problem. They needed to move vast armies rapidly during daylight hours without being destroyed from above, and they had absolutely no way to defeat the Allied air forces in combat. Since they could not destroy the enemy's air power, they realized they had to borrow time from nature itself. They had to neutralize the planes without fighting them. The solution was not a weapon, but a weather forecast. The German High Command recognized that Allied air superiority only existed over the battlefield when aircraft could physically take off, visually acquire targets, and safely attack them. If the visibility was zero, if the cloud ceilings were on the deck, if heavy snow and freezing fog blanketed the terrain, the massive American and British air fleets would remain grounded. The most powerful tactical weapon in the Allied arsenal would be rendered temporarily useless. This realization transformed the planning of the Ardennes offensive. It was not going to be an attack launched when the troops were merely ready. It was going to be an attack launched specifically during a period of predicted, severe meteorological deterioration. German meteorologists were tasked with identifying a sustained window of historically terrible weather, a prolonged period of dense fog, low stratus clouds, and heavy snowfall over the Ardennes region. They were deliberately seeking the worst possible conditions for an offensive operation. The very elements that would freeze infantrymen, choke engines with mud, and turn narrow forest roads into impassable ice slicks were considered absolutely essential. The bad weather was not a hindrance. It was the primary operational shield. This calculated use of nature began long before the first shot was fired. The assembly of the attacking forces, 3 entire German armies, including heavily equipped panzer divisions, had to be hidden from Allied aerial reconnaissance. For weeks leading up to the planned December start date, the Germans utilized the poor autumn weather to mask their massive buildup. Trains moved only under the cover of darkness or heavy clouds. Armored vehicles were camouflaged in deep forests. Radio silence was strictly enforced, forcing couriers to rely on physical dispatch riders. The goal was to build a sledgehammer right under the nose of the Americans, trusting that the gray skies would keep the Allied reconnaissance cameras blind. But the real gamble was the execution. The offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, was utterly dependent on speed and surprise. The plan demanded that German armored columns shatter the thinly stretched American lines in the Ardennes, race through the narrow, winding road networks of the forest, and seize the critical bridges over the Meuse River within mere days. They had to reach the river and split the Allied seam before the massive American and British strategic reserves could be brought to bear. The German planners knew that the shield of bad weather was strictly temporary. They were not purchasing a permanent reprieve from the Allied air forces. They were simply renting a few precious days of operational freedom. Every meteorological forecast indicated that eventually the high-pressure systems would shift, the winter storms would pass, and the skies would clear. When that happened, the full, devastating weight of the Allied tactical air forces would return instantly. Therefore, the entire operation became a frantic race against the barometer. The speed of the advance was not just a tactical goal, it was the fundamental metric of survival. The German spearheads had to reach the Meuse River and consolidate their positions while the sky was still gray. If they were caught out in the open, bogged down on narrow roads, or stalled short of their objectives when the clouds finally parted, the offensive would be doomed. The plan was a high-stakes, all-or-nothing bet. It was a massive military machine, wound tight, waiting for the weather to grant it permission to strike. The Germans had secured their perfect storm. They had engineered a scenario where, for a fleeting moment, the immense technological and numerical superiority of the Allied air forces was irrelevant. The movement of the German armor, the initial breakthrough, and the frantic push toward the Meuse were all predicated on the assumption that the sky would remain closed. But a storm only buys hours, and every single hour of that borrowed time had to be paid for with unrelenting forward momentum on the ground. The countdown had begun before the first tank even started its engine. Before dawn on December 16, 1944, the borrowed time began to expire. The German artillery barrage shattered the quiet of the Ardennes, and thousands of troops and armored vehicles surged forward into the biting cold. The weather held exactly as the meteorologists had predicted. Dense, freezing fog clung to the valleys, and low, heavy clouds blanketed the entire front. The massive Allied air forces, parked on airfields across France and Belgium, were effectively blinded and grounded by the storm. The initial shock was devastating. Thinly stretched, completely surprised American divisions suddenly found themselves facing a massive coordinated assault by heavily armored German Panzer Corps. The weather was actively shielding the German columns, allowing them to mass, move, and strike without the constant paralyzing fear of aerial interdiction. The strategy appeared to be working perfectly. Thousands of vehicles, including the massive Tiger and Panther tanks, were grinding westward under the protective cover of the gray sky. But the German planners had calculated only the speed of their advance against the meteorological clock. They had not calculated the sheer stubbornness of the American infantry. The German offensive demanded constant, unrelenting forward momentum. It required the panzer divisions to slice through the American lines, bypass strong points, and race down the narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes toward the Meuse River. The reality on the ground immediately began to unravel that rigid timetable. The American defenders, despite being shocked, outnumbered, and often surrounded, did not simply melt away. In the north, around the Elsenborn Ridge, exhausted American infantry and artillery units dug in and refused to break, physically blocking the designated route of the formidable 6th Panzer Army. Their fierce resistance forced massive German armored columns to halt, reroute, and attempt to find alternative paths through an already inadequate road network. Further south, at the vital road junction of Vith, an ad hoc collection of American armor, infantry, and engineers formed a desperate defensive perimeter. Vith was not a strategic fortress. It was a small Belgian town. But several critical paved roads converged directly in its center. The German plan relied on capturing that town immediately to funnel their supplies and reinforcements westward. By holding Vith for nearly a week, the American defenders created a catastrophic traffic jam behind the German lines. The fighting at these isolated crossroads was brutal and desperate, but its true strategic value was measured in time, not territory. The American soldiers were not defeating the German offensive outright. They were stealing its most precious resource. The German tanks needed to cover dozens of miles a day to reach the Meuse before the weather broke. Instead, they were spending entire days fighting for single intersections. Every bridge blown by retreating American engineers, every desperate stand at a nameless village, every detour forced upon a German panzer column consumed hours. The delay began to force the German high-speed thrust into a series of massive, sluggish bottlenecks. The narrow, muddy roads of the Ardennes, barely capable of handling heavy military traffic in ideal conditions, were quickly choked with thousands of German vehicles, fuel trucks, and horse-drawn artillery, all crawling forward at a fraction of their planned speed. The offensive was slowing down, and the protective gray clouds above them were not going to last forever. The American resistance was systematically forcing the entire German army to mass its vehicles on the few available roads, creating exactly the kind of massive, vulnerable targets that would doom the offensive the moment the sky cleared. The German timetable was hemorrhaging hours, and nowhere was this more devastating than at the small Belgian market town of Bastogne. Look at a map of the Ardennes, and the problem becomes immediately obvious. The region is heavily forested, characterized by steep ridges and deep valleys. The road network does not resemble a neat grid. It is a tangled web of narrow, winding lanes that inevitably converge on a few key intersections. Bastogne was the most critical of these hubs. 7 main roads radiated outward from its center. For the German 5th Panzer Army, pushing hard toward the Meuse River, Bastogne was not an optional target. They could not simply drive through the woods to avoid it. Heavy armor and vital supply trucks physically required the paved roads that ran directly through the town. The German plan demanded that Bastogne be seized rapidly, allowing their columns to flow through the intersection and continue west without breaking momentum. Instead, the town became an anchor that violently dragged the entire offensive to a halt. The swift arrival of the American 100 1st Airborne Division rushed in on the back of open trucks, combined with remnants of shattered armored units, forged a desperate perimeter around the town. The German High Command, obsessed with maintaining speed, made a critical decision. They could not afford to stop the entire 5th Panzer Army to reduce the town. They ordered their armored spearheads to bypass Bastogne and continue the push toward the Meuse, leaving trailing infantry divisions to encircle and capture the stubborn American defenders. This decision effectively transformed a high-speed, concentrated armored thrust into a massive, sprawling traffic jam. The roads leading up to Bastogne were blocked. The German spearheads pushing further west were now relying on secondary, narrow roads that bypassed the town. Roads that were quickly turning into deep, freezing mud under the weight of thousands of heavy tracks. The encirclement of Bastogne meant the Germans were now fighting a static siege while simultaneously trying to supply a deep penetration offensive. The primary logistical artery they desperately needed was severed. The required speed of the operation was fracturing against the physical reality of the terrain. Meanwhile, miles away in their headquarters, the Allied High Command was experiencing a profound shift in perception. On the morning of December 16th, the initial reports filtering back from the Ardennes were confused and fragmented. The heavy fog that shielded the German advance also blinded Allied intelligence. Commanders initially believed they were facing localized spoiling attacks, minor probes designed to disrupt their own planned offensives. They could not see the massive armored columns moving beneath the clouds. But as December 17th and 18th passed, the sheer scale of the crisis began to pierce the fog of war. Entire American regiments were being surrounded and destroyed. The sheer volume of artillery fire, the identification of elite panzer divisions, and the depth of the German penetrations painted a terrifying picture. The realization hit the Allied command with physical force. This was not a localized counterattack. This was a massive, strategic offensive aimed at splitting their armies in half. The genuine operational danger set in. The Allies possessed overwhelming reserves, but they were positioned far to the north and south. The German spearheads, moving beneath the impenetrable gray ceiling, were tearing a massive hole in the center of the line. The race was now visible to both sides. The Allies desperately needed to move reinforcements into the path of the German advance, while the Germans desperately needed to reach the Meuse before those reinforcements arrived. And hovering over this entire frantic race was the heavy, unbroken cloud cover, continuing to deny the Allies the use of their most lethal weapon. As the battle dragged into the period between December 19th and December 22nd, the German offensive began to suffer from profound, compounding structural failures. The spearheads were still pushing west, and the situation for the Allies remained incredibly dangerous. Bastogne was completely surrounded, its defenders running perilously low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. But the German advance was no longer a swift, coordinated strike. It was becoming a sluggish, agonizing crawl. The primary culprit was fuel. The German military economy in late 1944 was in ruins. The Ardennes offensive had been launched with a shockingly tight fuel budget. The planners had allocated only enough gasoline for the initial breakthrough, operating under the dangerous assumption that the rapidly advancing panzer divisions would capture massive American fuel dumps along the way to sustain their drive to the Meuse. But the stubborn American resistance at places like Vith and Bastogne had shattered those calculations. Tanks idling in massive traffic jams, or maneuvering heavily in combat instead of cruising down open roads, consumed fuel at a catastrophic rate. American quartermasters, realizing the danger, deliberately set fire to millions of gallons of gasoline just before German vanguards arrived, denying them the prize. The German logistical network, stretched thin and forced onto muddy, inadequate secondary roads, began to collapse. Traffic jams behind the German lines stretched for miles. Supply trucks carrying artillery shells and precious fuel were physically blocked by the massive armored columns they were supposed to resupply. The command friction was immense. German generals found themselves personally directing traffic at minor intersections, frantically trying to untangle miles of stalled vehicles. The spearheads, the very tip of the offensive, began to sputter and die. Tanks simply ran out of gas. their crews forced to abandon them on the side of the road. By December 22nd, the Allied command had fully recognized the vulnerability of the German position. They could see that the offensive was running out of momentum, starved of fuel, and choked on the narrow roads. The causal chain was clear. The limited road network, compounded by fierce American resistance, had caused massive congestion, which in turn caused the fuel consumption to skyrocket, while simultaneously preventing resupply. But the Allies also knew something else. The German columns were massive, incredibly concentrated, and dangerously exposed on the few roads they controlled. They were a perfect target for tactical aviation. The only thing preventing the absolute annihilation of the stalled German logistical network was the weather. The conflict was now defined by a lethal mathematical equation. The slower the German advance became on the ground, the more days of bad weather they desperately needed to survive. The German spearheads had stretched themselves to their absolute limit. They were starving for fuel, isolated from their supply bases, and surrounded by gathering Allied reserves. Their survival, their ability to either push forward or safely withdraw, rested entirely on a single condition. They needed the thick, gray sky to hold just a little longer. But the sky did not hold. On the morning of December 23rd, the borrowed time abruptly expired. A high-pressure system from Russia, cold and dry, pushed into Western Europe, sweeping away the heavy stratus clouds and the freezing fog. For the first time in a week, the sun shone brightly over the Ardennes. The effect was immediate, overwhelming, and absolute. The protective gray armor that had shielded the entire German operation was stripped away in a matter of hours, revealing a sprawling, stalled military machine exposed beneath a brilliant blue sky. Above Bastogne, the transformation was psychological as much as it was tactical. The American defenders of the 101st Airborne, shivering in frozen foxholes and rationing their last rounds of artillery ammunition, heard the drone of approaching engines. Hundreds of C-47 transport planes, completely unhindered by weather, swarmed over the perimeter, the sky filled with colorful parachutes, dropping tons of artillery shells, medical supplies, and K-rations directly into the besieged town. The isolation was broken. The defenders knew they were no longer cut off from the massive logistical power of the Allied war machine. The prospect of a quick, inevitable collapse, which the Germans desperately needed, evaporated in the morning sun. Simultaneously, the vast tactical air fleets of the United States Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force were unleashed. Fighter bombers, P-47s loaded with rockets and bombs, and Typhoons armed with heavy cannons poured into the airspace over the Ardennes. The narrow roads, choked with miles of stalled German tanks, fuel trucks, and horse-drawn artillery, were suddenly clearly visible from thousands of feet in the air. The German logistical network was instantly transformed into an exposed kill zone. The impact on German movement was catastrophic. Columns that had been slowly grinding forward were suddenly forced to scatter. Truck drivers abandoned their vehicles, seeking cover in the snow. Panzers desperately tried to maneuver off the narrow roads and hide beneath the sparse winter tree lines. Movement during daylight became nearly impossible. Every attempt to shift reinforcements, every desperate effort to push fuel trucks forward to the starving spearheads was met with relentless aerial strafing and bombing. The speed of the German operation, already crippled by American resistance on the ground, was now completely paralyzed from above. The sprawling, congested road network, essential for maintaining the momentum of the offensive, had become a deadly trap precisely when the Germans needed to move the fastest. The clearing of the sky did not create the fuel shortage crippling the German army, but it violently amplified it, turning a logistical crisis into a fatal structural collapse. The equation on the ground had already shifted against the Germans. The most successful panzer divisions, those that had driven the deepest into the American lines, were now the furthest from their supply depots. They were stranded at the end of long, inadequate, and congested road networks. To sustain their momentum, they required a constant, heavy flow of gasoline and ammunition trucks moving unimpeded from the rear. Now, That entire supply chain was laid bare under the brilliant blue sky. Allied reconnaissance aircraft, blind for a week, finally mapped the exact shape of the German thrust. They didn't just see tanks. They saw the miles-long traffic jams of soft-skinned supply trucks, the horse-drawn artillery struggling through the snow, and the critical choke points at bridges and intersections. With this intelligence, the fighter-bombers did not simply attack randomly. They systematically dismantled the German ability to sustain the offensive. They hunted the fuel convoys. A single P-47 Thunderbolt strafing a line of gasoline trucks could obliterate the fuel supply meant for an entire armored battalion in a matter of seconds. The synthesis of the weather breaking and the underlying structural failures created a devastating feedback loop. Because the roads were choked with traffic from the unexpected American resistance, the supply columns were grouped into massive, slow-moving targets. Because they were massive targets, they were easily destroyed by the newly unleashed air power. And because the supply columns were destroyed, the advanced Panzer spearheads were starved of the fuel and ammunition they desperately needed to break the deadlock. The operational freedom the Germans had enjoyed for 7 days vanished in a single afternoon. The sudden return of Allied air superiority meant that any movement during daylight was suicidal. German commanders were forced to halt their columns, pull their vehicles off the roads, and hide in the forests until nightfall. A desperate race that required covering dozens of miles a day was suddenly restricted to a few hours of slow, chaotic movement in the dark. The German army was now trapped in a paradox of its own making. The deeper they had penetrated, the more vulnerable they had become to the very weapon they had tried to neutralize with the weather. The clearing sky rapidly accelerated the moment when massive Allied structural advantages in manufacturing, in logistics, and in air power were brought to bear against an army that was already stalled, fuel-starved, and fighting on borrowed time. The gamble was unwinding, not just because the weather changed, but because the weather change exposed the fundamental inability of the German war machine to sustain a massive offensive in the face of absolute Allied material superiority. It is tempting to look back and wonder what might have happened if the high-pressure system had stalled. What if the heavy stratus clouds and freezing fog had held over the Ardennes for another 3 or 4 days? The German columns would have retained some measure of operational freedom. The defenders at Bastogne would have remained isolated, their supplies dwindling critically without the massive aerial resupply. The Allied fighter bombers would have stayed grounded, unable to hunt the fuel trucks and stalled panzers. But military reality is rarely defined by a single variable. Even if the sky had remained impenetrable, the underlying rot within the German offensive was already terminal. The structural limitations that had plagued the operation from the first morning, the catastrophic lack of fuel, the narrow, inadequate road network, the massive traffic jams, and the gathering strength of Allied ground reserves were not created by the clear sky. They were simply exposed by it. The offensive was already fracturing under the weight of its own logistical impossibilities and the stubborn resistance of the American infantry. The clearing of the sky on December 23rd stripped away the final illusion. It revealed the deeper, unforgiving strategic truth of the late war. Germany had become a hollowed-out military power, structurally incapable of competing with the vast industrial, logistical, and aerial supremacy of the American and British war machines. They could no longer dictate the terms of engagement based on their own strength. Instead, they were reduced to hiding in the shadows of temporary meteorological conditions. The bad weather had never granted the German army superiority. It had merely imposed a temporary pause on the absolute supremacy of the Allies. It was a fleeting, fragile shield built entirely on borrowed time. The entire offensive was an admission of weakness, a desperate understanding that their massive armored columns could only survive if the enemy was blindfolded. Adolf Hitler had gambled the remnants of his Western armies on the hope that the winter fog would last just long enough for the speed of his panzers to overcome Germany's profound structural disadvantages. He needed the clouds to buy him days, But the American soldiers, fighting desperately for nameless intersections and frozen ridges, systematically stole those days away. They forced the German army to bleed its momentum into the mud, stalling the spearheads long before they could reach their strategic objectives. And when the sky finally cleared, it illuminated a defeated army that had completely run out of borrowed time. The German tanks had not suddenly become weaker. The narrow roads of the Ardennes had not physically moved. The devastating difference on the morning of December 23rd was simply that the sky was no longer protecting them. Hitler had wagered his last great offensive on a few borrowed days of winter fog, banking on speed to overcome reality. But American resistance on the ground bled that speed away, hour by agonizing hour. And when the clouds finally parted, the German spearheads were still hopelessly short of the Meuse, instantly reconnected to the full, lethal weight of the Allied war machine.